Guess what? It's Tuesday. It's only been a week since last Tuesday. I'm on time. Write it down. It's not going to happen. Well, no, it is. It's going to happen again. It's going to happen again every week. Yes. And I'm not going to forget. Okay. So, welcome back. It's Tuesday. It's time for another chapter of Talking to Dragons by Patricia Reed. And this is chapter 11. See, we're almost halfway through the book. We're a little more than halfway through the school year, though, so I'm going to have to start reading 2 chapters at some point. But not today. So, today is chapter 11, in which a lizard suggests a solution. So remember, Shiera is currently a statue. Very sad. I sat there for a minute, staring at the statue and wondering what to do. Finally, I looked at the dragon. Do you know anything about magic? Of course I do, the dragon said. Everyone who lives near the enchanted forest knows something about magic. I sighed. I mean, do you know anything about turning statues that used to be people back into people again? Because I don't, and we have to figure out some way to fix Shiera. Oh. The dragon looked doubtfully at the statue of Shiera. We could take her to the living spring and drop her in, it suggested. That would bring her back to life. You know where the living spring is? I said in surprise. No, said the dragon, but I bet if we found it, it would work. I shook my head. I don't think we have time. There are wizards looking for us, remember? Oh, that's right. I keep forgetting. I don't like to think about wizards. The dragon blinked. What about your sword? You could say that spell again. I nodded. I walked over to Shiera and pulled the sword of the sleeping king out of its sheath. I felt a little uncomfortable, partly because I hadn't thought of using the sword. Oh, excuse me. I'm sorry. It's not the company. I felt a little uncomfortable, partly because I hadn't thought of using the sword, and partly because the dragon spell was still just one of Mother's nursery rhymes to me. The idea of standing in the middle of the enchanted forest holding a magic sword and reciting a nursery rhyme made me feel very silly. I looked at the statue of Shiera again, and decided I'd try anyway. Slowly, I lowered the point so that it touched the statue's shoulder, and I said, Power of water, wind, and earth, turn the spell back to its birth. Raise the fire to free the Lord by the power of wood and sword. For a minute, I thought nothing had happened, but then 3 or 4 little tingles ran up my arm from the sword. I hadn't even realized they were missing until they started again. When I finally did notice, I was relieved. Mother wouldn't have been at all happy with me if I'd ruined the sword of the sleeping king. Unfortunately, Shiera was still a statue. I suppose we're going to have to look for the living spring, I said, unless you have some other ideas. No, said the dragon. I've never been on an adventure before. How are we going to find the spring? I don't know, I said. Half of the heroes who'd stopped at our cottage had been looking for the living spring, but I'd never heard of anyone finding it. I tried to think of someone who might know where the spring was. Suz, I said suddenly. What? The dragon said. What? The dragon said. Suz is a sort of friend of mine, I explained. He says he knows everything that goes on in the enchanted forest, so he ought to know where the living spring is. I wish he was here. You do? Said a squeaky voice by my right foot. Yes, you really do. How intriguing. How are you? Or why do you? Sorry, can't read. Why do you? Suz, I said. I looked around until I saw him, then carefully sat down on the ground. I'm awfully glad to see you. Do you know where the living spring is? The living spring, Suz said. Dear me, why do you want to know? What's that? Asked the dragon, who had finally managed to find the source of the squeaky voice. It looks like a dragon. Oh, I'm sorry, this is Suz. I was just telling you about him. He's not a dragon, he's a lizard. A lizard of extremely good family? Suz frowned at the dragon, but the dragon didn't seem to notice. Suz gave up and looked back at me. That's like the teacher look when it doesn't work. Oy. Okay. Da-da-da-da-da. Now, why do you want to know about the living spring? Because Shiera got turned into a statue by the fire witch who lived in the invisible castle, I said. Duh. Yeah. She did? The lizard peered over until he saw the statue, then scurried over. He cocked his head briefly and stared upward, then ran up the gray stone in a spiral until he was sitting on one of the statue's shoulders. She really did! How exceedingly distressing! What are you going to do about it? We thought if we dropped the statue in the living spring, it would, well, fix Shiera, I said. But we don't know where the spring is. You don't? No, of course you don't. It's a secret. Suz peered at me from Shiera's shoulder. I suppose you want me to tell you where it is. He considered for a moment. I couldn't possibly do that, so you needn't bother asking. But Suz, I said, how else can we fix Shiera? I've tried the only other thing we could think of, and it didn't work. That is extremely obvious, the lizard said severely. He ran down the side of the statue and stopped right in front of me. If it had worked, she wouldn't be a statue anymore, and you wouldn't be asking me silly questions. Suz did whatever the thing was that he did to balance on his tail. People who are looking for things in the Enchanted Forest have to find them for themselves. You really ought to know that. You really ought. Well, what are we going to do about Shiera if you won't tell us where the spring is? My goodness gracious, you certainly are persistent, Suz said. Have you tried kissing her? Kissing her? I said incredulously. That means he doesn't believe it. Kissing the statue, Suz explained condescendingly. It's one of the standard cures for being made to sleep for years, or being turned into a frog, or a statue, or such. Have you tried it? I felt my face getting hot. Well, no. Well then, Suz said pointedly. I thought about it for a minute or two. Shiera might object. Shiera might not think much of my kissing her, but I didn't really object, especially if it would break the spell. In fact, I sort of liked the idea. Ew. Okay. At that point, I stood up very quickly because my face was getting even hotter and I could feel Suz staring at me. I was right next to the statue, and as soon as I was all the way standing, I leaned forward and kissed it. I didn't want to take time to look before I did it because I didn't want to think about it. First, I felt cold stone, but it warmed up right away. A second later, Shiera jerked away and said, Hey, Daystar, what on earth do you think you're doing? It worked, I said. I was awfully relieved. If we hadn't been able to break the Fire Witch's spell, we'd have had to bring the statue with us, and carrying a statue around would have been a lot of work. Besides, having Shiera back felt good, even if she was glaring at me. What worked? Shiera demanded suspiciously. And where did that witch go? She was here a minute ago. You were a statue, the dragon informed her. The Fire Witch did it, but Daystar got rid of her. I'm glad he did, it added thoughtfully. I didn't like her. She wasn't polite at all, and she, the dragon leaned forward and said in a loud whisper, and she grew dragon's bane. Shiera stared at the dragon, but before she could say anything, there was a loud squeak from behind me, and Suz's voice started shouting, Help! Murder! Wild beasts and dangerous lunatics! Oh dear! Oh my! Help! Help! Goodness gracious! Help! Oh! I turned around. Night Witch had come out from wherever she'd been hiding and sneaked up on Suz while I was, kissing Shiera. Suz was rolled into a tight golden ball, and Night Witch was batting him back and forth between her paws in wide-eyed fascination. I didn't think she'd ever played with a ball that yelled at her before. I bent over to pick up Night Witch, but before I actually got hold of her, the lizard uncurled very quickly, slapped his tail sharply against the kitten's nose, and curled up tight again. He didn't stop yelling the whole time. The kitten jerked her head back so fast she sat down hard on her tail, and I grabbed her. It's all right now, Suz, I said. The lizard poked his nose out of the ball. You're quite certain? He said. Yes, of course, I said. Suz uncurled a little more. This sort of thing is quite unsettling, he said. I do not approve at all. Dear me, no, not at all. I'm very sorry, I said. I'm afraid I didn't know she was there. People who keep wild animals ought to know where they are so they don't go around eating other people, the lizard said. Sounds like a good thing, yes. He uncurled the rest of the way and lay on the moss, peering reproachfully up at me. I bent down, and Suz scooted back a couple of feet. You keep that beast away from me. Night Witch isn't a wild animal. She's a kitten, Shiera said indignantly. And I don't believe she meant to eat you. She just wanted to play. She's too young to know better, I said. Shiera glared at me, and I added hastily, Night Witch, I mean. Oh, Shiera thought that she meant, yeah, okay. She is? The lizard squinted at Night Witch from a safe distance. Yes, I suppose she is, he said reluctantly. How unfortunate. I really do think I'd better leave. Dear me, yes, I really must. Suz nodded and headed off to the woods. Suz, wait, Shiera called. The lizard stopped and looked back over his shoulder. What is it? I'm sorry Night Witch scared you, Shiera said. You are? Suz turned around and ran back to where Shiera was standing. He cocked his head at her and then did his tangled tail balancing trick and stared up at her. Why, you really are! How astonishing! How extraordinary! How extremely unexpected! I was a little surprised myself, but I decided I'd better change the subject before Shiera got offended. Suz, the lizard turned his head and looked at me. What's the best way to get to the castle where Kazal lives? I asked. Why, it's... Suz paused. Dear me, there seems to be an invisible castle in the way. How ridiculous. I'm afraid you'll just have to go around. That's what I thought, I said, but thank you anyway. It's quite all right, and I really must be going now. I really must. Goodbye. Suz bowed politely, then did a quick backflip and scurried off into the woods. And thank you for telling me how to change Shiera back, I called. Suz didn't answer. I turned back to find Shiera glaring at me again. All right, Daystar, explain. What's all this about statues and getting rid of witches? I already told you all that, the dragon said in an injured tone. Why do you want him to tell you again? Because I didn't understand it when you told it, Shiera said. She sounded a lot like Mother. And I want to know what's been going on. She sat down on the ground and looked at me. So explain. I explained. Shiera let me talk until I started to explain how we'd finally turned her from a statue back into Shiera, and then she interrupted. You don't have to keep going, she said. She gave me an odd look. I remember that part. Oh, I'm sorry, I offered. My face was getting hot again, but no one could think of anything else, and it did work. Shiera wasn't paying much attention. Daystar, did your sword burn your hands when Antril tried to throw that spell at you? She asked suddenly. No, I said, relieved by the change of subject. It didn't do anything at all. It did too, Shiera said. It ate Antril's spell, and it didn't do anything to you. Why didn't it work like that on the Fire Witch's spell? Who's Antowel? Asked the dragon. The wizard you were sneezing at when we met, I said. He's not very pleasant. Wizards aren't, the dragon said. Daystar, this is important, Shiera said. Why didn't your sword work the same way on the Fire Witch as it did on Antril? Fire witches and wizards are different, I said. It makes sense that the sword does different things to them. Yes. I wish it would get rid of Antril, though. Then I could stop worrying about him. Shiera said something else, but I missed it. All of a sudden, I had the same itchy feeling I'd had earlier, as if someone were watching me. I looked over my shoulder, but there wasn't anyone there. Just trees. Excuse me, I'm sorry. Daystar? Shiera almost sounded worried. I'm all right, I said, but can we get started and talk about this somewhere else? We still have to get to see Kazal, and there's an invisible castle in the way. Shouldn't we do something about the people she turned into statues for her garden? Shiera said, looking nervously at the clearing where the castle ought to be. Why? Said the dragon in a puzzled tone. Because it wouldn't be right to just leave them there, I said. No one seemed to like the idea of going into the castle. No one wanted to leave the Fire Witch's statue people there either. We spent a little while trying to figure out how to get into the castle. Shiera wanted to climb over the wall, but I didn't think that was a very good idea if we couldn't see the wall or what was on the other side. Finally, she agreed to help me look for a door or a gate or something. We stretched our hands out in front of us and walked carefully toward the castle. It wasn't there. We walked a little further. It still wasn't there. We walked around the clearing for a few minutes while the dragon watched with interest. Eventually, we gave up. I don't understand, Shiera said, as we came back to pick up Night Witch and Morwen's bundles. Where did it go? Maybe the Fire Witch moved it while she was talking to me, I said. A whole castle? That fast? Besides, didn't Suz say it was still in the way? It must have moved since he left. Shiera stopped, and her eyes widened. Daystar, you don't think she could still be around, do you? She isn't around anywhere. She isn't around anywhere, the dragon said positively. She went up in smoke. I saw her. Good, Shiera said savagely. I must have looked awfully surprised because Shiera glared at me and added, She deserved it. You don't know what she had to do to make that castle invisible. What was it? The dragon asked curiously. Shiera glared at it too. I don't want to talk about it. Why not? The dragon said. Because she tortured people to death, Shiera shouted. It was part of the spell, and I know how to do it, and I don't want to think about it. I told you she wasn't a very nice person, the dragon said. Shiera snorted. She picked up Night Witch and her bundle and walked straight across the clearing. After a couple of seconds, the dragon and I followed. Once we got across the clearing, the dragon took the lead again. Nobody said much for the rest of the morning, which was fine with me. I still felt as if someone was watching me, and I didn't like it. Finally, even the dragon noticed. "You look a little strange," it said. "Is something wrong?" "I don't think so," I said. "I just feel like someone's watching me." "You're imagining things," Shiera said. "I've been looking since you told me about it this morning, and I haven't seen anyone." "Someone's following us?" the dragon said. It blinked at me, then turned in a slow circle, eyeing the trees. "You're right," it said finally. "Someone is following us. That's not polite." Before Shiera or I could say anything, the dragon's head shot out towards one of the trees. I'd never seen anything move so fast. There was a loud yell from someone who wasn't the dragon. Then the dragon yelped, and a bunch of leaves came drifting down to the ground. I heard a couple of crashing noises, and another louder yell, and then the dragon reappeared. Dangling by the seat of his pants from the dragon's mouth was an elf. I stared for a minute, trying to decide whether this was the same elf we'd met before. He looked the same, but all elves look alike. Besides, he was yelling and kicking, and every now and then the dragon would shake its head, which made it hard to see the elf clearly. I almost laughed. The dragon looked a lot like a very large cat with a very small mouse. Nightwitch evidently thought so too. She eyed the wriggling elf with some interest, then glanced up at me. "Meow," she said. "I'm afraid he's too big for you," I said. "He certainly is," yelled the elf. "Put me down. Let me down at once." "Noof," said the dragon through a mouthful of cloth. "I don't think he wants to," I said to the elf. "Why were you following us?" "Hey," said Shiera, "are you the elf we ran into before? Because if you are, I want to talk to you." The elf stopped struggling and looked down at Shiera. "Sorry." Ugh. Then he twisted around. It's my bedtime. Then he twisted around and looked at the dragon. "On the other hand, maybe I'm better off up here," he said. "Oof," said the dragon, and shook its head violently. "Yo!" said the elf. "Help! I surrender!" "Really?" Shiera said skeptically. "Really?" said the elf. "Absolutely, completely, and without question. Will you put me down?" "Maybe you should," I said to the dragon. "I don't think he can get away from all of us, and it will be a lot easier for you to talk." The dragon looked at me for a minute, then slowly lowered its head and dropped the elf in a heap in front of us. The elf lay there breathing hard, while Shiera, the dragon, and I closed in around him. As soon as we stopped moving, he bounced to his feet and spun rapidly in a circle, bowing to each of us. Then he sat down cross-legged and looked up at us with bright black eyes. "Now," said the elf, "what can I do for you?" And that's the end of chapter 11. Next is going to come chapter 12, in which they ask many questions. And I believe in chapter 12, we get to meet another character. Yes, and I'm very excited because he's one of my favorite characters. And so, tune in next week for chapter 12 of Talking to Dragons. And until next time, I will see you around. Bye!